Welcome to Module 4 of our learning session. This module focuses on noticing systemic discrimination. If you haven't watched Modules 1, 2, and 3, we encourage you to do so. Module 1 provides an introduction to our office and offers an overview of the entire session and explains how to use the different components of this web-based learning session. Module 2 answers the question, what is systemic discrimination? And Module 3 looks at the impacts of systemic discrimination. We will ask you to pause and reflect during this module, so consider having a pen and paper available to write down your thoughts if you find that helpful. Let's take a look at what we've learned so far. We've learned to identify the key elements of systemic discrimination and explain the differences and relationship between systemic and interpersonal discrimination. We've become familiar with the nature and extent of the impacts of systemic discrimination, and we've identified who is impacted by systemic discrimination. In this module, we're going to be practicing noticing systemic discrimination in your daily lives. Some people may find noticing systemic discrimination difficult, especially if they're not impacted by it frequently or severely. But for many of those impacted, it can be all too easy to notice. The goals of this module are to explore tools that can help you notice systemic discrimination in your organization and in your daily life. And we'll do this by considering why noticing systemic discrimination may be difficult and look at and explore strategies to address this. Let's take a moment to reflect on your ability to notice systemic discrimination before participating in this session today. Have you noticed examples of systemic discrimination in your daily life before participating in this session? Was it easy for you to see? Please take a moment to write down your thoughts.
Take a few minutes to reflect on this question. Why can systemic discrimination be difficult to notice? So the images on the slide may provide some clues to answer this question. The images don't represent examples, but they're there to inspire reflection on barriers to identifying systemic discrimination. And again, feel free to pause the recording while you reflect. Okay, here are some reasons that our office has identified as to why we may not notice systemic discrimination. The first is that systemic discrimination is hard to see if we are not directly impacted. If we aren't impacted negatively by a policy or practice, we may not notice it. And here it's represented by this white skin color band-aid, which provides a clear visual example of this challenge. If these band-aids match your skin, you may not notice that they are completely unsuitable for someone with a darker skin tone. Sometimes people are impacted but don't notice it as systemic discrimination. If a behavior or policy has become normalized over time, some people impacted by it may assume that their negative reaction is their own problem, even though the problem lies within the behavior, policy, or practice. Another reason why it may be hard to see is that it may appear neutral. If a practice or policy corresponds with the way a majority group or groups with more power do things, it may start to look like a neutral policy, even though it has negative impacts on some people. An example are these gendered washroom signs, which may appear neutral to some, but can be stigmatizing and non-inclusive for non-binary or trans people. When a policy, procedure, or behavior only impacts a small group of people negatively, it is often seen as neutral. An example of this is a police policy allowing use of force in self-defense. It may seem reasonable and thus a neutral policy, but it's also a fact that a disproportionate number of Black and Indigenous people are harmed by this policy, and that demonstrates that it is indeed not a neutral policy. Another reason that systemic discrimination may be difficult to notice is that it can be normalized over time. Once a policy or practice is put into place, it becomes the standard way of doing things without questioning whom it might impact. An example of this is the calendar. Canada has statutory holidays that correspond with the Christian religion, such as Christmas and Easter. Statutory holidays haven't changed with the changing population in our province, despite the different religions practiced in our very diverse population. Another reason systemic discrimination can be difficult to notice is that identifying it can be uncomfortable. And this is represented by the person looking at themselves in the mirror. Self-reflection can be uncomfortable, and most people see themselves as good people with good intentions. We've seen that the negative impacts of systemic discrimination are often unintentional, but they remain harmful. Acknowledging our contributions and benefits from systemic discrimination can cause discomfort, and it can be easier just not to think about it. Concern for resistance and negative consequences may prevent identification of systemic discrimination as well. When people impacted by systemic discrimination or their allies try to talk about it, they're often met with resistance or even repercussions. So many learn to avoid talking about it, and this is represented by the boat. BC society often values not rocking the boat and accepting the way things are done and minimizing issues that we really should address. For all of these reasons and for others, for many people, noticing systemic discrimination isn't easy. It takes practice. We'll introduce a tool that may help to identify systemic discrimination in organizations. A second checklist is available for identifying systemic discrimination in daily lives. Both are available in your handout. Just please keep in mind that checklists are guiding tools and don't provide definitive proof that systemic discrimination is occurring. Okay, we're going to ask you a couple of questions, but before we do so, we'll ask you to think about a policy or a practice in your organization. And when we talk about practices, we're talking about ways of doing things, such as selecting candidates for promotion, meeting procedures, meeting days, work hours, things that aren't written down as policies, but are ways that you are consistently doing things in your organization. Okay. Try to answer the questions in relationship to the policy or practice that you're thinking of as we work through these questions. The answer no to any of the questions indicates that systemic discrimination is probably occurring. Okay, let's look at item 1. Let's consider the policy or practice using the first item in the checklist. Consider your organization's policies and practices. The first questions that were asked is, were all voices considered in developing policies and practices? Some points to reflect on include whose voices were considered, whose were left out. Were groups with histories of lesser power consulted? And this includes those protected under BC's human rights codes, as well as other groups, such as those identified under the category of social condition. Now, I want to explain things a little here because it can be a little bit confusing and complex. When considering and consulting, reflect on which groups are impacted by that policy and practice, especially in the case of policies and practices that are designed to address concerns of barriers to that group. Okay. The second question is there an informed reason for doing things this way? And some points to reflect on include, did your organization consider alternative policies and practices? And does the reason for this policy and practice go beyond, we have always done things this way, why change? Consider the policy and practice using a second item in the checklist. Examine the impacts of the policies and practices. First question to ask is, are all groups able to participate? And a second question is, are groups who have histories of lesser power experiencing the same level of harm or penalty as other groups? Okay, Now, to reflect on our third item in this checklist, we'll ask you to think about a common behavior in your organizations. So, examples of commonly accepted behaviors include commonly used language, what people joke about, who people sit with at lunch, etc. Consider this question. Do these behaviors have either no impact on or positive impacts on groups who have histories of lesser power? The fourth item in the checklist is the most important. Reflect on how you answered these questions. Did you observe? Did you consult with different groups? Did your organization track negative impacts for different groups? And did you consider how policies, practices, and behaviors might impact groups with a history of lesser power? So this checklist and one for identifying systemic discrimination in daily lives are available in the handout, as we already mentioned, and this time they're as fillable forms, which means you can actually type right into the handout. Consider using them after the session to help identify systemic discrimination in different settings.
We've come to the end of Module 4. The next module introduces what you can do at a personal level to address systemic discrimination. Before proceeding to Module 5, we invite you to download the PDF of the presentation and the handout for Module 4. The handout contains fillable checklists for noticing systemic discrimination in your organization and in your daily life. You can use these tools to begin considering whether systemic discrimination is present in these settings. Thank you for participating in Module 4 of Introduction to Systemic Discrimination.